Local time, February 18th. The US and Russia held talks in Saudi Arabia. The first round has concluded, officially ended. Talks lasted 4.5 hours. Russia's delegation was led by Foreign Minister Lavrov and Presidential aide Ushakov. The U.S. delegation was led by Secretary of State Rubio and National Security Advisor Michael Waltz. Ushakov, a close Putin ally, has advised him on foreign policy since 2012, a key figure in Russian diplomacy. Waltz is a staunch conservative. He opposed investigating the Capitol riot, gaining Trump's favor, and becoming a trusted aide. After Trump took office, he was appointed National Security Advisor. Both delegations had high-level officials, aiming for real results. After the talks, speculation ran wild. The question is, what did they actually discuss? According to Secretary of State Rubio, the U.S. and Russia reached 4 agreements. 1. Restore diplomatic ties. 2. Find a resolution to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. 3. Plan post-conflict geopolitical and economic cooperation. 4. Ensure productive progress. On all these goals, Russian Deputy FM Grushko stated, the talks in Riyadh were an initial step. Their purpose. Both sides outlined their positions. Simply put, each side established their red lines. Everything else is negotiable. To advance further talks, both sides agreed to restore embassy staffing. In 2017, the U.S. Embassy in Moscow had over 1,200 staff. Meanwhile, the Russian Embassy in Washington had about 455. Relations worsened. Both sides cut staff. By late 2024, both embassies had just over 100 staff, a drastic drop from peak numbers in 2017. Making operations difficult. For comparison, the U.S. Embassy in China has 1,300 staff, while China's U.S. Embassy has over 500. Embassies need staff due to visa processing demands and security operations. They can't function short-staffed. Intelligence officers are also embedded. For information gathering, a known practice. These factors keep embassy staffing high. In December 2021, Russian Ambassador Anatoly Antonov stated, "We face severe staff shortages." At the same time, the U.S. State Department warned, due to staffing issues, the Moscow embassy would limit services in 2022. Under Biden, though ties weren't severed, embassies struggled to operate, to rebuild relations, and advance negotiations. Restoring staff and embassy functions is essential. This was the key outcome of the talks. Less significant than expected. No signs of a ceasefire yet. Disagreements remain. Should a ceasefire follow current front lines? The U.S. supports deploying peacekeepers. Russia strongly opposes. For Russia, peacekeepers are like occupying forces, uncontrollable and unpredictable. Another key issue, NATO's 2008 pledge to admit Ukraine and Georgia encouraged their resistance. Russia insists NATO must revoke this promise, preferably in writing, not just verbally. Russia demands a permanent ceasefire, not temporary. The 2014 Minsk Agreement taught Russia a lesson. No room for Ukraine to regroup. Ceasefire must be final. Trump can't guarantee that. He has only 4 years. Beyond that is uncertain. Even a promise now means little. Without resolving these issues, a ceasefire is unlikely. Russian aide Ushakov warns. Putin and Trump's meeting conditions were discussed. Diplomatic norms dictate. Leaders only meet after major progress. In diplomatic talks, without breakthroughs, meetings don't happen. When a final decision is needed, leaders step in. Ushakov hinted significant progress is possible. Talks are advancing. 2 biggest losers in these negotiations, Ukraine and Europe. Ukraine is on the table. Europe is sidelined. The war happens at Europe's doorstep, yet the EU was excluded from talks. This weakens EU's geopolitical influence, even in its own backyard. 10 years ago, things were different. After Crimea, 2014. Despite tensions, Russia and Ukraine reached a deal under German-French mediation, the Minsk Agreement. Regardless of details, it showed EU still had influence. Countries had to respect its role. Now, the EU is sidelined. Post-2022 war, EU faces capital outflow, deindustrialization, inflation, and declining geopolitical influence. For example, Russia and Ukraine cooperated on two key issues: prisoner exchanges and the Black Sea grain deal. Russia allowed Ukraine's grain exports without blockade in the Black Sea. The UAE and Saudi brokered the exchanges. The EU had little role. Turkey led the grain deal efforts. Whenever renewal was uncertain, Russia cared more about Erdogan's stance, not the EU's opinion. Russia hesitated, but renewed after Erdogan's urging. In 3 years of war, the EU failed to mediate any major deal, while Turkey, UAE, and Saudi took the lead,
igniting US declining influence.
During US-Russia talks in Saudi, the EU was entirely excluded. Germany's Rheinmetall CEO, Armin Papperger, compared Europe's role to children at a separate table, an apt description of Europe's diminished status. While US and Russia negotiated, Europe scrambled to hold its own Paris meeting. The outcome? Continued disagreements, little consensus, and no real influence. No wonder Trump ignored them. They failed to assert themselves. Going forward, the EU's geopolitical influence will decline. Some lose, others benefit. For developing nations, this is a pivotal moment, including China. Since the Cold War, the West dominated, imposing its will despite resistance. By 2022, no real challenges emerged. Western expansion continued. Confronting NATO seemed impossible until the Russia-Ukraine war. Russia never intended full NATO confrontation, but the war escalated into just that. Through 3 years of war, Russia held firm,
resisting NATO offensives,
regaining battlefield control. Prolonged conflict led to negotiations. Had Russia collapsed, no talks would have occurred. Not even Trump's ties with Putin would have led to negotiations. What isn't won on the battlefield won't be gained in talks. Russia's resilience forced talks. War turned against US interests, prolonging it was no longer viable. Trump had to cut losses. Decades of NATO expansion met its first major roadblock, stopped by Russian force.